For decades, a persistent rumour has circulated that Anne Boleyn was pregnant at the time of her execution on May 19, 1536. This theory is regularly repeated, often as a means of underscoring the depravity of Henry VIII. It is said, for instance, that his hatred for his second wife was so great that he even prioritized it over his legendary desire for a male heir. While this moral condemnation of Henry may not be misplaced, the specific accusation is inaccurate. Anne Boleyn was not pregnant during her execution. This misinformation originates with historian Alison Weir, who made several glaring errors in her work. The matter has already been thoroughly addressed by other sources, such as history calling, so I will only touch on it briefly here. What is particularly intriguing is that Weir later corrected herself. Despite this, the rumor continues to persist. To some extent, Weir herself is responsible for its endurance. However, the phenomenon also illustrates a broader issue that anyone engaged in the study of history should be familiar with: how misinformation can take on a life of its own. The origin of the rumor can be traced to Alison Weir's book, Henry VIII, King and Court, first published in 2001. I am referencing the 2011 edition, where the relevant passage appears on page 375. The key statement reads, "Contrary to the opinion of nearly every modern historian, Henry had every reason to be pleased with Anne, for the evidence strongly suggests that she was pregnant again." Henry made what was probably an oblique reference to her pregnancy that April, when he rounded on Chapuis for suggesting that God had not thought fit to send him male issue, because he had ordained that England should have a female succession. "Am I not a man like other men? Am I not?" shouted Henry. On the 25th of April, in a letter sent to his ambassador Richard Pate in Rome and duplicated to Gardiner and Wallop in France, Henry announced the likelihood and appearance that God will send us heirs male. Weir suggests that, following Anne's miscarriage and Henry's severe accident in January 1536, the couple reconciled. She argues that Henry likely impregnated Anne in February or March, with both convinced by April that she was pregnant. However, this interpretation is flawed for several reasons. First, the quote attributed to Chapuis is not from a letter written in 1536, but rather from one dated 1533, referencing Anne's pregnancy with Elizabeth. Second, the statement about the likelihood of Henry having a male heir, dated April 25, 1536, did not originate with the king. Instead, it was introduced by the Habsburgs as part of a diplomatic effort to encourage Henry to reinstate Mary in the line of succession after Anne's children. Henry merely echoed this idea in his letter to Gardiner and Wallop. In truth, such analysis may be unnecessary, as it is self-evident that Henry would not have risked executing his wife if she were carrying his male heir. Weir herself acknowledges this on page 377, writing, "Anne was doomed. In the normal course of justice, her pregnancy would have saved her from a death sentence or at least postponed it. But this child could never be allowed to live because the king would not dare risk a disputed succession. Nor, however, could he be seen as a monarch who put an innocent baby to death, which is perhaps the reason why some of the documents relating to Anne's trial were destroyed. No further mention is made of her pregnancy, and it is perhaps significant that she was not made to undergo an examination by a panel of matrons before her execution, as Lady Jane Grey did in 1553. Anne herself never mentioned her condition whilst in the Tower, but neither did she make any reference to her daughter Elizabeth. In both cases, she must have realized that to do so would be futile, for Henry had hardened his heart against her. According to this argument, Henry sought to avoid both an ambiguous succession and the perception of infanticide. To achieve this, Weir suggests he concealed Anne's pregnancy, circumventing a medical examination and potentially destroying court documents related to her trial. Yet, Weir's own reasoning undermines her argument. Anne herself never claimed to be pregnant, and Weir hypothesizes that Anne refrained from doing so because she realized it would be futile. This explanation oversimplifies matters. Historical evidence indicates that Anne was deeply concerned about Elizabeth. If the letter attributed to Anne, dated May 6, 1536, is authentic, though its authorship is debated, it explicitly mentions her daughter. "You have chosen me from a low estate to be your queen and companion, far beyond my desert or desire. If then you found me worthy of such honor, good your grace, let not any light fancy or bad counsel of mine enemies withdraw your princely favor from me, neither let that stain, that unworthy stain of a disloyal heart towards your good grace, ever cast so foul a blot on your most dutiful wife, and the infant princess, your daughter." This passage underscores Anne's concern for Elizabeth, casting further doubt on the theory that Anne's alleged pregnancy would have gone unmentioned by the Queen herself. As mentioned earlier, Alison Weir eventually revised her stance. In her book, The Lady in the Tower, The Fall of Anne Boleyn, published in 2011, she addresses the source from April 25, 1536, on page 117, stating, "Taken at face value, this suggests that Henry was still sleeping with Anne, and it could even imply that he thought she was pregnant again, which is highly unlikely. We should not read too much into him publicly referring to her in such affectionate terms, because he was merely using the conventional style employed by royalty when writing of their spouses. While this assessment does not fully resolve the issue, it represents a step closer to the truth. In my opinion, Weir realized her earlier error but refrained from openly admitting it, opting instead for this nuanced form of correction. A few additional points merit consideration. First, if we accept the interpretation that Anne was pregnant during her execution, the Habsburgs would presumably have been aware of it. They had no reason to suppress such a detail, yet there is no mention of her pregnancy in their accounts. Instead, we encounter statements like one from Eustace Chapuys, dated February 25, 1536, which highlights Henry's apparent estrangement from Anne after her miscarriage. I learned from several persons of this court that for more than 3 months, this king has not spoken 10 times to the concubine, and that when she miscarried, he scarcely said anything to her, except that he saw clearly that God did not wish to give him male children. Furthermore, in the 19th century, Anne's grave was opened and her skeleton examined. Predictably, no evidence of pregnancy was found. This is unsurprising, given the passage of time and the fact that she would have been in the early stages of pregnancy, even if the claim were true. Additionally, the medical capabilities of the 19th century were far less advanced than those available today. Nevertheless, this examination rules out the possibility of using such physical evidence to confirm that Anne was pregnant at the time of her execution. In conclusion, the available evidence, including Chapuys' observations and the absence of any corroborating details from contemporary or later sources, supports the conclusion that Anne Boleyn was not pregnant during her final days. Why does this argument persist so stubbornly? First and foremost, the blame lies with Alison Weir herself. As noted earlier, I am using a 2011 edition of her book that perpetuates the false rumor. This edition was published in the same year as her work in which she corrected herself. Despite recognizing the error, she apparently did not find it necessary to have the incorrect information removed. While I can only speculate about her reasoning, I suspect she was reluctant to sacrifice the dramatic impact of the claim, which undoubtedly carries a certain shock value. This point ties closely to the broader phenomenon I want to highlight, something all historians understand. Sometimes the truth takes a back seat to a compelling story. Mistakes happen, and unfortunately, they often sound far more dramatic than the truth. As a result, they tend to spread further and faster. Corrections, by contrast, seldom receive the attention they deserve. The persistent belief that Anne was pregnant at her execution is a perfect example of this dynamic. To illustrate this phenomenon further, here are the true versions of some widely misunderstood historical facts. The Romans did not sprinkle salt on the ruins of Carthage to render the soil infertile. Napoleon was not particularly short. His height of 1.67 meters, approximately 5 feet 4 inches, was average for his time. George Washington did not have wooden teeth. His dentures were made from materials such as animal teeth and even human teeth. Albert Einstein did not fail math. As a teenager, he failed an entrance exam for the Polytechnic Institute in Zurich because it was conducted in French, a language he struggled with. Mathematics, however, was the one section he aced. Vikings did not wear helmets with horns. This myth originated in the 19th century, thanks to German composer Richard Wagner's romanticized portrayal of Norse warriors. I'm sure many of you can think of other examples where the truth has been overshadowed by a sensational story. These instances serve as important reminders of the need for critical thinking and a healthy dose of skepticism when encountering historical claims. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe.